Hi, everyone. We have, it looks, unless the flags are there to reserve spaces, we have space at the table if folks want to come up. Please, especially non-party observers, please don't feel the need to sit in the back. Again, there are plenty of seats, so I encourage people who are sitting in the back to please come up. Okay, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining. Thanks for all of those that registered and are in this room. Again, the registration and the breakout was just to make sure there was good evenness across the 4 rooms. But please come to the front if you'd like to have a seat at the table. There's still room. I thank you all for participating in day 2 of the Glasgow Dialogue. Today we have the 4 guiding questions that came to us from the SBI chair vis-a-vis the ExCom of the WIM. I don't really have any opening remarks other than that hopefully this is the next 3 hours we can have a good dialogue about financial support for loss and damage. So with that, I will open up the floor. Who would like to start? U.S.
Would you mind by maybe reiterating the guiding questions to start us off? Thanks.
I will have them posted. They are, I will read them, but hopefully the Secretary will help post it. The first question is, what are the arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with the adverse impacts of climate change? So what are the arrangements for funding loss and damage? The second question is, what support has been effective at averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage? What lessons learned could improve funding, and what practices should be replicated or scaled up? Question number 3, what are the barriers and challenges countries face in accessing these arrangements and funding? And question 4, what can be done to improve and utilize synergies and complementarities among the arrangements for the funding of loss and damage? And we'll hopefully have those questions out. Just one note, this session is open to anyone who's registered for SB 56. So we have participants who are online, and I'm told that there's a way also to have their engagement, so hopefully we can make that happen, and it's live streamed. The EU.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm just a question for clarification. Are we going to go one question at a time or all questions at the same time?
I'm going to put forward, we try to go one question at a time, but I also know that there wasn't a lot of time yesterday for people to speak, so I also want to give some flexibility. But the idea is probably be best if we went question at a time. Antigua Barbuda.
Thanks a lot, Madam Co-Facilitator, and good day again to colleagues. I know that it was highlighted yesterday, to come not with prepared statements, but I think given sometimes how we look at this topic, it's said that, for example, developing countries don't know what they want, they don't have logical arguments as it relates to addressing loss and damage. I think it's only appropriate that we just present it in a methodological manner, and I will heed to your suggestion on focusing on question at a time. So if you permit me, what I'll do is just go under question 1. It's a bit long, but I know we have 3 hours, and I'm sure we can. Hopefully, I won't be too long. But thanks a lot, Madam Co-Facilitator. Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to once again address the identification of existing arrangements to address loss and damage. So that's where this AOSIS statement will be focused on, speaking on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. So this is not the first time AOSIS has addressed this question, including through the different convention and Paris Agreement processes. So examples include, in 2016, the Standing Committee on Finance had a forum, and it brought together a group of parties and technical experts to consider financing for loss and damage. The forum report identified mechanisms for addressing loss and damage, which include risk transfer schemes, social protection schemes, catastrophe resilience bonds, and contingency finance. It also set out the gap in financial instruments for addressing slow onset events. Other challenges with various instruments included market barriers, high or contentious premiums for risk transfer schemes, inadequate/lack of subsidies for low-income households, among others. So that's in 2016. In 2018, I'm sorry, just pausing here, Madam Co-Facilitator, is it possible that I would be able to, I guess, submit to you as Co-Facilitator this intervention, and hopefully whatever the outcome of this session is, you could present it to the SBI chair for, I guess, her whatever her decision is on the matter. Just a clarification before I continue.
Please, you're welcome to share it with me And I'll share it also with Joe, my co-facilitator as well.
Greatly appreciated. So in 2018, the SUVA Expert Dialogue provided input for a technical paper on elaborating the sources of financial support available for addressing loss and damage, both inside and outside of the convention, in accordance with the mandate set out in Decision 4 CP22. Among other things, it highlighted challenges faced by SIDS and LDCs, inter alia insufficient financing to reduce risk, including for relocation, limited sources of finance, particularly for high indebtedness of some countries, and importantly, timely access to post-disaster finance for recovery and reconstruction. In 2019, the Secretariat published the technical paper, a very crucial technical paper on the elaboration of sources and modalities for accessing financial support for addressing loss and damage, and highlighting that it was focused on addressing loss and damage solely, even though the content of the paper tried to scope out a bit and noted the limitations of trying to find data because they lacked that data for financial support that addressed loss and damage. But I'll discuss that a bit further. To inform the 2019 review of the WIM, which we all remember happened in Madrid. We also had the review of the WIM, which also was informed by a revised compendium on comprehensive risk management approaches, and it was developed by the executive committee of the WIM. Subsequently, the review of the WIM acknowledged that there was a variety of sources of finance that may support activities which address loss and damage, but highlighted the need for additional and scaled up finance and the need for additional work on finance in areas of loss and damage. The CMA also requested that the ExCom to establish an expert committee, which they did, and they commenced their work on that. In 2020, the GCF board, in its updated strategic plan 2020 to 2023, included under its strategic vision only, the fund will also continue providing and facilitating efficient access to resources for activities relevant to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. Noting that it's good for us to unpack a bit that watering down coming from the addressing, that was the discussion in the Secretariat's paper, to now a discussion on activities relevant to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And this was, from the negotiation history, a place in which the parties landed, from our understanding, in Madrid, to try and have some compromise and mention to loss and damage as it relates to the GCF. This was through the guidance that we were negotiating in Madrid. And to the extent that it was consistent with, and which I do need to highlight, so all of these activities need to be, to the extent it's consistent with the existing investment results framework and funding windows and structures of the GCF. And we'll go down and explain why exactly that those current structures are not adequate enough to provide us with funding to address all loss and damage and addressing those needs that we have as developing countries. And this was a collaboration with the UNFCCC and others to help conceptualize relevant instruments. So in addressing the gap in the funding arrangements, these and other existing and informed outcomes should serve as hopefully a useful input to closing the gaps that were clearly highlighted by all parties who did make the interventions in the opening plenary, both developed and developing. I think there was a clear, as well as the technical experts who did highlight the gap. So all that said, let's have a preliminary assessment of the existing landscape. So based on our understanding of this work, AOSIS is in agreement that there are some funding arrangements for addressing certain types of loss and damage, but do not have the internal structures or modalities in place to adequately address all loss and damage, both in the short term and the long term. So let's paint a picture here. We like storytelling in the islands, right? So island nations are increasingly faced by more frequent and more intense extreme weather events and the continuous erosions of our shores of many inhabited islands, leading to the displacement of our communities and getting closer and closer to this real and brewing existential threat. So from these extreme weather and sudden and slow onset events, impacts ensue. And to respond to these impacts, funding arrangements must be capable of programming climate finance for the following activities, among others. So first, the rehabilitation of damaged assets, ecosystem, and heritage. Next, the recovery of lost assets and income for people, businesses, and governments. After that, you have the social protection and organized relocation of affected peoples. And then last, you have measures to address permanent loss of, among other things, land and ocean territories and their associated ecosystems, livelihoods, culture, and heritage. However, the existing funding arrangements do not address these. Here are some examples from our SIDS experiences, grounded in our unique combination of special circumstances. So this includes our small size and population, remoteness, as well as our particular vulnerability to external shocks, including environmental and economic shocks. So if we apply to the Green Climate Fund, in the context of loss and damage from extreme weather events, we are faced with lengthy and bureaucratic processes. And these were highlighted yesterday as much and admitted as much by the GCF Secretariat. So this includes an average of 12 to 22 months for the approval processes of project development, and an average of 24 months for a project approval when it's applied through a direct access accreditation modality. There's also the requirement to prove the climate relevance of the projects through scientific studies at the local level, which we do not have available. And when we do not have available, it's literally looking at the discussion of historic data, which we cannot ever get back. You'd have to go back in time, make sure that you put in a weather instrument 30 years back, and then collect that data going forward. So there's a huge amount of burden for this specific type of financing in order for us to, which requires high upfront costs, as well as the time to produce, as well as sometimes the impossibility to get that data. So this is the Green Climate Fund, and looking at that from an extreme weather event. And so I asked colleagues, like, can we count on the GCF, as was highlighted yesterday between the dialogue between the GCF and then the question from the delegation of Mexico in relation to urgency, that there was a clear response that 10 days after an extreme weather event, you cannot get, or whether it be a month or 3 months after, you cannot get a clear understanding and a clear approval of a project to run alongside a development project when you are rebuilding, rehabilitating your infrastructure, for example, in a small and developing state. So let's quickly turn on to the Adaptation Fund. If you apply to the Adaptation Fund, it's a fund that is working, but it's poorly capitalized. And nevertheless, there's a clear mandate to respond to adaptation needs, which can be and are distinguished from addressing loss and damage. Next, you also look at the Global Environment Facility, another undersourced source of funds. And one that many SIDS access to is restricted to their star allocation, which is basically the country allocation that you have as different developing countries accessing the GEF, which can only be used for mitigation. So let's be clear as well. So the GEF as an option is not there. So this leaves us only with the Special Climate Change Fund, which depends on voluntary funding pledges, which, as a result, we cannot, which urgently needs the resources required in order to adequately address loss and damage, not to even discuss on the modalities. Some may turn to regional risk transfer mechanisms, and indeed they play an active role in providing immediate assistance in the aftermath of climate-induced extreme events. But it's clearly not sufficient, as stated yesterday by the CRIF, who made a presentation. And this assistance is often limited to shoring up governments fiscally, and in the aftermath of an event, does not otherwise directly address physical and non-economic loss and damages. So that option is also insufficient. So generally, where such activities are covered under current funding arrangements, they are also typically characterized as high-risk projects for which direct access entities are not accredited to access support for. Oftentimes, in addition to being hard hit by loss and damage associated with human-induced impacts, the inequities that follow for us, having to use our own national budgets, and as well taking on more debt to address these matters. So, quickly going on to specific issues related to responding to slow onset events. So, however, no funding arrangements exist from our understanding to help particularly vulnerable developing countries, especially SIDS, to cover the cost of loss and damage associated with slow onset events, such as resettlement of populations from areas rendered inhabitable due to climate change, and measures to address loss and damage, among other things, of ecosystems as well as our heritage. Noting these challenges, and there are quite a few AOSIS members in the room, I invite them to make and share their experiences. So the next, I'll discuss reforms, and I guess our approach to reforms as AOSIS over the past 5 years. So colleagues, we know what the challenges are, and we've kind of clearly stated them. AOSIS has been highlighting these for some 30 years, but especially in the last 5 years, that I've been heading climate finance negotiations for AOSIS. And we take the opportunity of this Glasgow Dialogue to propose some reforms to modalities, once again, that we've made in the context of other rooms to ensure that we are more understanding of what we need to address loss and damage. So firstly, on the Green Climate Fund. While the GCF Readiness Support, Project Preparation Facility, and project funding provide some support for activities to address loss and damage, the modalities and procedures to access this funding are incompatible with the urgency of the issue on the ground in vulnerable countries on the front line of these impacts, such as SIDS. So the GCS Independent Evaluation Unit concluded that the GCF modalities do not effectively consider and take into account of the urgency and the unique climate challenges faced by SIDS. This results in these funds failing to reach those on the ground who urgently need it, as was discussed yesterday. So in order to make these funding arrangements work for SIDS, AOSIS maintains its long-standing view for the need for a number of operational modality reforms for the operating entities of the financial mechanism. So for example, under the GCF, we proposed the following reforms in the past. First things first is the incorporation of a strategic direction. This goes beyond the strategic vision that focuses the Green Climate Fund on enhancing support specifically for addressing loss and damage in its strategic plan. The next is an envelope under the Readiness and Proprietary Support Program with a substantial allocation for each country to develop a national loss and damage needs assessment and response plan, which would include, among other things, the development of a national methodology and system for assessing and quantifying loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change, and outlining approaches on how to manage such loss and damage once it has occurred. Next, we also looked at an emergency response window to fund projects in a rapid response manner based on a parametric trigger, post-extreme weather events, with the main objective to build back better critical infrastructure consistent with a climate-resilient development pathway as a means of addressing the loss and damage faced by developing countries, with a minimum allocation floor for those particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. Fourth, and this was last year, we wanted to establish a request for proposal to enhance the funding of parametric insurance for climatic events in risk insurance facilities at a national and regional level. For example, the ARC, the PCRAFI, which is the Pacific Risk Facility, as well as the CRIF, including subsidizing premiums that countries pay to be eligible for insurance payouts. And the fifth and final one that I'll discuss is an urgent adoption of programmatic policy approaches that address the unique combination of special circumstances that I meant before, as well as the climate financing needs of SIDS, as well as the transaction cost of working in SIDS. So such a policy approach must cover loss and damage from slow onset events and allow the implementation for between 20 and 100 years. So this is the scale that we're looking at when the science is discussing on how we programmatically address slow onset events. If not, they do not address the unique combination of circumstances that we have as SIDS and the increased transaction costs that we have to address these loss and damage. These proposals are, of course, non-exhaustive, and we believe that they are a starting point for reforming the current climate finance architecture and filling in the gaps, which such reforms are not enough, however. So, including that we do need the establishment of a loss and damage finance facility. In conclusion, it is clear that the current funding arrangements is neither fit for purpose in many ways, and in many instances not available, and in most instances inequitable. The facility that is to follow this dialogue is one that should take into consideration all the solutions that we are proposing and more. Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive and rich response to these set of questions. I think this kicks off today's breakout group quite well. I don't see other flags up. I can't actually see Philippines, please.
Thank you, Chair, for giving Philippines the opportunity to manifest our response to hopefully fast-track the completion of this dialogue and achieve the most needed outcome. It is clear to all of us that climate change is real and has been causing havoc that have affected lives, livelihoods, and the health and longevity of economies. Borrowing from the words of the Executive Secretary in her opening statement in the GGA workshop this morning. We now share our views and recommendations for consideration, and these are based primarily on how in the Philippines have coped up with assisting communities that suffer losses and damages because of disasters we attribute to climate change. To address loss and damage arising from climate change, a preposition fund, which may be called the Glasgow Facility for Loss and Damage, should be established from which to quickly draw funds to support disaster-affected countries. This facility should be sourced from annual contributions of developed country parties based on their historical responsibilities under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. This should be in addition to other risk transfer mechanisms such as, but not limited to, catastrophe bonds, parametric insurance, forecast-based financing, crop insurance, some of which are in place on pilot basis. The release of the loss and damage Glasgow facility shall be triggered by nationally determined thresholds based on the extent of losses and damages and the relief needed by affected areas or states. In the Philippines, a declaration of the state of calamity is the trigger for the release of a quick response fund to assist affected communities. The proposed facility should cover the amount of loss and damage brought about by climate-induced slow onset and extreme hazard events. The fund should be predictable, stable, and easily accessible. On mechanisms that have been effective, there are a couple, but what needs to be enhanced is the sustainability of such mechanisms. And it is mandatory to capacitate trainers in an innovative approach that will integrate traditional knowledge in research and development to inform policies, invest in data capabilities with greater focus on vulnerable people for a more direct financing, a blended approach in financing which considers propriety of grant, investments, and subsidies as appropriate on the needs and nature of operations of public and private stakeholders, and a robust and deliberative monitoring and evaluation system that will inform development needs to address gaps. As for ways to improve and utilize synergies and complementarities, the modalities and procedures in accessing global funds should be efficient, streamlined, and simplified. And most importantly, unnecessary conditionality should be removed. While the Philippines urges for clear distinction between loss and damage and adaptation measures, and even while there are established mechanisms, the existing capacities are overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the impact and compounding nature of climate events. The existing financial resources and instruments on the local level are not enough and have limited applicability for addressing loss and damage. This is the reason for our strong voice not to preclude immediate action and support, and for the Glasgow facility on loss and damage to be set up and made available now and not a day later. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Philippines. Next on my list is, I don't know if it was Timor-Leste or European Union. Who was first? Timor-Leste.
Thank you very much, Madam Facilitator. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. Timor-Leste would like to speak on behalf of the LDCs. I believe that we can just answer question by question. It will be more than useful. Before I go through yesterday, many financial entities made a presentation, and then we went through that presentations, and it was useful to know that financial gap for addressing loss and damage is there. That's why we are here to try to find the solution for this issue. So in terms of the first question, what are the arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with the adverse impact of climate change? The LDC group is having some views as follows. Firstly, finance to address loss and damage needs to be based on international cooperation, which should be based on solidarity and polluter-based principles, especially in addressing irreversible and permanent losses and damages. However, it is often wrongly conflated with adaptation finance, which contributes to minimize loss and damage, and to some extent mitigation finance, which can avert loss and damage as well. The importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage is organized in the Paris Agreement. Avert refers to measurable or measures to avoid loss and damage, which is part of mitigation, we believe. While to minimize refers to reducing loss and damage before it occurs. So this is, we believe, part of adaptation issues. Addressing loss and damage refers to measures that responds to loss and damage that is not avoided or reduced through mitigation, adaptation, and other measures such as risk reduction. Further, loss and damage finance cannot be characterized as disaster risk reduction, DRR issues, and risk layering instruments on its own, nor can it be covered entirely by humanitarian aid. DRR is better to shock. Humanitarian aid is an immediate response to disasters. It is a reaction triggered by a shock and is short-lived, addressing situational specific needs from the countries. Loss and damage is cooperation based on solidarity and meeting the needs of communities to current and future impacts of climate change, both slow onset events and rapid events. We do believe that loss and damage finance facility should make a significant and ambitious contribution to combat climate change by focusing exclusively on addressing loss and damage itself. Once again, addressing loss and damage itself. It must be established as an operating entity acting as the third pillar of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, which also serves as the Paris Agreement itself. As both are coordination and also financing mechanism, it should be the primary vehicle to coordinate, mobilize, and channel new, additional, adequate, and predictable financial resources to address loss and damage for developing countries and affected communities in developing countries, including people itself. While the loss and damage finance facility is an operating entity of the financial mechanism, it should be situated under the Warsaw International Mechanism to perform its functions, especially third function of the WIM. This would allow alignment with the WIM's existing mandate, including by building on the work and activities of the WIM ExCom and the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage that we are still discussing about. While the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage will catalyze technical assistance to implement the function of the WIM, the Loss and Damage Finance Facility will contribute by providing the necessary finance to address loss and damage. As an operating entity of the financial mechanism, it should be accountable to the Conference of Parties and also CMA itself, as well as WIM, and function under the guidance of projects, programs, policies, plans, coordinated, and other activities to address loss and damage in developing countries. Some of existing bodies under the Convention financial mechanisms can complement this loss and damage finance facility by building off their existing roles and functions. Function of the loss and damage finance facility would be providing oversight over funding for addressing loss and damage from within existing funds under the UNFCCC financial mechanism and the financial mechanism of the Paris Agreement, as well as for funding mobilized and dispersed outside of the UNFCCC framework itself, including by determining its additionality to financing provided by averting, minimizing loss and damage. So I could stop here, and I will be back for another question. Once again, thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator.
Thank you, Timor-Leste. European Union.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the speakers who spoke before me. I think it's been very insightful. So to the first question, I fully agree with what was said by Ambassador Adao, speaking for the LDCs, that averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage cannot be reduced to only disaster risk reduction or only humanitarian action. The funding arrangements that do exist are complex, and it's an interwoven network of arrangements that extend well beyond the scope of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And it's increasingly capable of supporting developing countries to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with the adverse impacts of climate change. Individual entities, including the operating entities of the UNFCCC financial mechanisms, international financial institutions, as well as national budgets and other development and humanitarian finance, fulfill different functions within this interwoven network. And their response time and nature of programs can be effective in various stages and types of intervention, matching their accumulated expertise. So going into very much of what we already heard from AOSIS and what we heard yesterday, the GCF shared their experience, and they highlighted that they are in many ways aligned with the work streams of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and showed examples of projects that avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. They also said it constitutes around 25% of all approved projects in the GCF. And 16% of which have thematic links directly to loss and damage. The Adaptation Fund shared that although they don't have an explicit mandate to address loss and damage, they are still a relevant stakeholder in the field as they contribute to reducing exposure to climate-related hazards, for instance, through 20% of their portfolio being dedicated to early warning systems and disaster risk reduction. They also highlighted many other funding projects on water and coastal management, food security, etc., and that can be delivered with benefits as regards to loss and damage activities, and that funds are available for countries to use as they wish. We also note the Special Climate Fund, which was raised by AOSIS. And we also heard briefly from the G7 colleagues on the Global Shield initiative, which we think is useful to point out and a part of the existing climate and disaster risk finance and assurance arrangement, including the INSU Resilient Global Partnership, the Global Risk Finance Facility, the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery, regional risk pools, such as the ones mentioned by AOSIS, which enables countries to meet the needs of people vulnerable to natural disasters. And within the Glasgow Dialogue, we should look closely at what this already provided in terms of support via this arrangements. And other important examples are activities on the work in the field of early warning systems. We heard from VMO yesterday that only 40% of VMO members have early warning systems that address all hazards, which means that on the ground, a third of populations is currently not covered by early warning systems. And therefore, we think it's really important that the UN Secretary General launched an initiative to strengthen early warning systems to ensure that by 2025, all people are protected by these systems. The disaster risk reduction initiatives is also a key piece of the funding arrangements, and they're key to promote coherent alignment between disaster risk reduction strategies, national adaptation plan, financial plans, and adaptation plans, ensuring that national level decision makers, practitioners, and researchers have access to hazard vulnerability and exposure data, which is critical to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. We also heard from the humanitarian community that the humanitarian system is capable and is an effective partner for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, both in terms of sudden onset events and in the effects of slow onset events such as drought and famine. Also, anticipatory action is important to smooth transition while upholding rights, for example, having plans, partnerships, and protocol already in place. Finally, we should not forget the development cooperation, which, for instance, in the case of EU, always needs to integrate climate as a significant part. We believe that the Santiago network has potential to make this interplay between all of these actors in this network more effective in supporting implementation to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage in the most vulnerable countries, as well as potential to better help identifying areas where more could be done to reinforce this framework. I will stop there for this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, European Union. And since some are going through all four, feel free to come back at any time. Next on my list is Guinea.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, co-facilitator of the session. To be honest, I think it is actually beyond my rationale that we still, under this convention, have to work hard and convince that there is no funding for addressing loss and damage. As you know, for us as the Asian, loss and damage finance should be based on solidarity, needs-based, and informed by science. And loss and damage finance, I hope, in the context of the Glasgow Dialogue, we will talk about resources, because that is, when we are talking about access modalities, it has to do with scarce resources. The more resources are there, the access will be simplified and improved. And we also think it's very important to make the difference when it comes to loss and damage financing. Averting is, for us, we're expecting that all countries, but particularly developed countries, takes the lead in terms of mitigation. Minimizing is actually adaptation, which is very crucial for Africa, and because adaptation is not a strategic option, it is a priority that we actually are integrating in our development plan. Whether we have NAPs or not, it is an imperative. And addressing loss and damage, it refers to, to measures that respond to activities or to events that is not avoided or reduced through mitigation, adaptation, and other measures such as disaster risk reduction. So I'm actually in line with colleagues that are indicating that loss and damage cannot be characterized as a disaster risk reduction, and that disaster risk reduction is triggered by shock. It is a buffer to shock. Humanitarian aid is an immediate response to loss and to extreme event or catastrophe, and it is only triggered when it's happened. But when we are talking about loss and damage, addressing loss and damage is not only to prepare for loss and damage, but also to look at after the shock. Preparing means that countries are endowed with means to integrate the risk associated with loss and damage, associated with risk related to loss and damage associated with climate change in their development plan, but also having strategies and response to address loss and damage. So loss and damage relates for us to the immediacy of finance experienced by developing country, and we can summarize as follows. For loss and damage, to address loss and damage, there is inevitable losses regardless of any climate action that is taken. So the quality of finance matters a lot. And it ranges from disaster risk response funding made immediately available. So we need, is not when some colleagues are talking about the access modalities, it is important that adequate resources are available on time. And sometimes, as we have seen yesterday, you need, even if the early warning system signals that an extreme event is happening, you need to have cash to vulnerable communities to move from the areas that are prone. We are talking also about social safety net strengthening for the most vulnerable communities and countries. We are talking about, but not only insurance facility for damages assets that affect livelihood and business, such as rebuilding infrastructure. Loss and damage, addressing loss and damage also include displacement costs linked to climate events, debt relief, and forgiveness. For example, I will give you an example. Mozambique was hit within 1 month, 2 years ago, by a cyclone. There was disaster risk reduction assistance there. There was humanitarian assistance there. The first week, the media was talking about it, but COVID-19, it was sidelined by COVID-19. And what's happened in Mozambique? Mozambique was forced to go to the capital market, to take loans at capital market rates, to pay the development gains of decades. There were GDP incidents that are up to 2 to 3%. In the African chapter of the IPCC, there is a very strange empiric evidence that is talking about 26% in Mauritania when it's come to drought. And that is heavy. And that's why I think it is undignified to discuss and to try to convince that we should talk about addressing loss and damage. For us, it is important that loss and damage main challenge is making resource available at speed for preparedness for event, for rebuilding, and for relieving strife caused by climate change. I have another example. We have, and I think that is very recent, 1 month ago, we had 2 flooding events in South Africa. And there, people report they can no longer get insurance for their places. They cannot get insurance for their places. So that is a small, tiny part of the world. How can insurance insure a country? Economic asset. Don't talk about non-economic asset. That's why for us, insurance is not a sustainable solution. Insurance has limits, and you have to go and understand academic words to make a good contract of insurance. And our vulnerable communities doesn't understand that. Insurance is, I think, one of the options to addressing loss and damage. We also think that loss and damage should reach, we need to have a system, do loss and damage facility that have oversight. The oversight is not only about money, it is, for instance, and I think that will be the best case, that wherever an extreme event happens, that the executive secretary of the UNFCCC call that country and apologize for failing to address what is happening in our countries. And I think that's what the loss and damage facility should do. We cannot compensate, we cannot rebuild because people have sentimental connection to what they build by their own, whatever high tech you bring there. And I think it is important from our perspective that we know that operating entities, I don't want to go into the detail, are failing to address. They are trying, but addressing loss and damage remains a big challenge. And I think we need a whole systemic approach to address loss and damage. We seek to have a funding arrangement under the convention, but also beyond the convention. I think this discussion should go beyond what is happening here. We need, when we are talking about access modalities, it's not only about operating entities, but also MDBs. And if you look at climate finance flows, the large share of climate flows are going through MDBs. And then you have in the reporting requirement, again, statements saying we cannot control, we cannot determine what is climate specific. And I think the access modalities to be effective and address loss and damage needs to be needs to have a whole systemic approach. We also think that at some point, climate events are escalating. From a practical perspective, there is really no limited mechanism. What we are talking about today, even we were to set a facility in 2030, it will not be fit for purpose. So whatever we are talking here, we should have a dynamic approach, dynamic and science-based, informed by science. A science that is agreed by scientists, which is IPCC. And I think my continent, you have seen yesterday, and the presenter from IPCC even indicated he doesn't want to promote Africa. But the science is clear. The science is clear. Africa is the most vulnerable continent. Most of our main cities, big cities, beautiful cities, are prone by sea level rise. In Cairo, for instance, you have for more or less 30 million. In Lagos, more than 20 million, and so on and so on. This beautiful city of Kapstadt, even Conakry, where I'm coming from, we are also prone by drought. We have, in preparing this event, discussed with some practitioners, and someone told us that a drought that happened in the late 80s, is still having problems in the countries. So the vulnerable communities have to find a new livelihood, and what's happened, they become more vulnerable. They cannot go to a city, they are at the margin of the cities. Some crops are no longer available, are no longer adequate for cropping. So I think, not to take too long the floor, I think we definitely need to have a whole systemic approach. There is an attempt to avert and minimize, but I guess addressing, we need to find a solution, and this solution needs to be science-based. This solution needs to be dynamic, evolutive, and fit for purpose. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I call the next person on the queue, I wanted to maybe just interject, since we are now an hour into this, I think, really useful conversation, in that I used to negotiate loss and damage, so I've been deeply engaged in this issue for a while. I hope that, especially, and I haven't been engaged in the last 4 years, coming back into this process, looking at the questions that are on the screen, I don't think I didn't think we were at a place where we were still convincing anyone about what loss and damage is, how important it is, and that funding needs, there needs to be financial support. So if anyone disagrees, I feel like this issue is so complicated, it's so important. I would like us to be as direct as possible and not talk past each other. So if you still need to be convinced on the need for funding activities for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, please say so. Otherwise, I'd like to make the assumption, I'm trying to think about this report out that I need to give back tomorrow. And I would like to have some assurances that no one needs to be convinced. There may be disagreements about what the response is, but hopefully we're past this point of what is it, tell me what you mean about what it is, and we're at a place of answering these questions of what are the arrangements. Because I think that's where I would like for us to really, it's been incredibly helpful for me to hear an articulation of the specifics of different positions. And if we can focus on the financial arrangements, which I hope is the essence of this dialogue, I know how important it is for, to express the magnitude and the importance of what the impacts are. And I don't want to stop you from doing that. But I do think that we should focus on then what the arrangements are. Sorry, that was a very long interlude, Marshall Islands.
Thank you, co-facilitator. So I totally hear what you're saying. You know, we want to get into the nitty-gritty of this discussion. And we want to make the assumption that everyone understands and believes the urgent need for loss and damage, but we still feel that we need to make the case for a breadth of the needs, the complexities of the issues that we're discussing, and the fact that current arrangements are still insufficient. So a really clear example of that kind of complexity, for example, is with the Marshall Islands. You know, we have this massive adaptation plan that we're trying to develop that's underway. That would entail elevating parts of different islands. You know, we have 24 coral atolls. It would entail like elevating parts of islands as well as even building specific islands. And so when we do that in our adaptation, those communities will be moved. There's going to be internal displacement, mass internal displacement, and that internal displacement is definitely an example of loss and damage right there. That's loss, but also loss of a loss of homes, loss of economic means, and then loss of cultural connection to that specific parcel of land. Because for the Marshall Islands in particular, we have really specific ties to land where, you know, a grove of trees has a legend that's tied to it. A coral head has a specific song attached to it. So that's an example of cultural loss that we talk about when we discuss like non-economic sources of loss and damage, you know. And when we're discussing this, so that's like a gray area here that needs to be addressed. You know, adaptation can't finance that, but something needs to be addressed in some form, and especially cultural loss. For those of us in the Pacific, that's a really big concern for us. You know, how do we even begin to put a price tag on thousands of years of culture? We're actually changing our land tenure system just so that we can adapt properly. We're gonna have to change it, and trust me, that's going to be a huge uphill battle for us back home. And so that's also another form of loss. So I think that that's something that we really want to emphasize is how difficult and how do we address that through this through these dialogues. But besides that, I also just want to make some really clear points. And so one of them is that we definitely should stop equating humanitarian finance and disaster risk reduction with loss and damage. So I've given you a bunch of examples of how different that is for those of us, many of us in the Pacific. And then besides that, insurance, it's a welcome piece of the puzzle, but it's just one piece of a larger puzzle. So that shouldn't be itself an issue. And then we've heard from the panelists yesterday about the different mechanisms for accessing finance. And, you know, I've heard in passing from other countries, you know, or other parties, they're just not applying for GCF. You know, there's not enough applications. They're just not trying. It's really difficult, and it's completely inaccessible for us. It took us, we had a drought, a national drought a couple years back, and it took us 4 to 5 years to get the financing that we needed to address water costs, you know, so that and it's just now getting implemented, you know, so I think that those funding mechanisms are completely inadequate. The understanding of AOSIS in agreeing a dialogue was that the loss and damage finance facility would be agreed and it would be established at the next COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. So this was officially recorded in the COP26 and CMA3 reports, you know, and there's new and additional financing to address that loss and damage would be critical to the lives and livelihoods of many. So we seek a finance facility first and foremost that links with regional mechanisms and that offers a toolbox of solutions based on the differing needs from the Pacific, Caribbean, Africa, and other regions around the world. Existing arrangements for addressing loss and damage are failing. We need to focus in this dialogue how to ensure that the institutions and entities are, like, first off, in place, second, capable of providing climate finance that addresses all loss and damage, and making sure that climate finance is accessible. So I do hope that the outcomes of this dialogue will be documented and that it'll feed into a formal process that leads to a finance facility. And then I just want to also just say that we align ourselves with the statements made by AOSIS about covering all of the different issues with the existing facilities. I think it was really thorough, and I hope that the dialogue really takes into consideration that history that developing countries have been fighting for this for so long, and that it's long overdue. So I think that's all I would have to say for now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Marshall Islands. Next is the United States.
Yes, thank you very much, co-facilitator. And I think I'd just like to start off by saying again, thanks to all of you for this really interesting and really useful discussion that we've been having over the last several hours, including our discussions yesterday. Coming from my perspective as a finance negotiator primarily, it's really helpful to have these kinds of conversations where we can really dig into the specific activities that we're talking about, the specific finance facilities, the specific mechanisms, and to have a real sense, a real understanding of what we are hoping to finance, what activities we're talking about, and get a better idea of the experiences of everybody in this room in engaging with, accessing, and ultimately deploying those funds. So having this opportunity to really have a frank and open dialogue about how this architecture exists currently and works is extremely helpful, and I really just can't express how much I personally appreciate the opportunity to do that. It's been really useful for me. I think in a way it echoes very much a lot of conversations I know we've been having domestically in the United States, thinking about how we can effectively respond to this call that we continue to hear from our developing country partners, small island states, least developed countries in particular. And I think we remain very interested and very ready to find ways to improve this architecture to make sure that it is fit for purpose and responds to these challenges that we are hearing raised. I think it's important to think a little bit about the trajectory that I think that we're on at the moment. I think for me, recognizing that we are on day 2 of a multi-year Glasgow Dialogue, I think what's really important for this stage, recognizing the urgency of this issue, is to continue to get an understanding of, as the first question asks, what the arrangements are right now. And then once we have a sense of what the arrangements are, what they're financing, then we can start to identify the gaps, the issues, and then the solutions for how we can begin to rectify those. So to just maybe say a little bit about the arrangements for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage as they currently exist. We've heard a lot of folks say in the room that there is a lot of support out there for averting and minimizing loss and damage already, and this includes inside and outside the convention. There is a host of support for mitigation activities that reduce emissions and therefore reduce the likelihood of loss and damage occurring to begin with. There are a host of institutions and activities that work very hard on adaptation, and in particular that tends to support minimizing loss and damage, reducing the effect of any damage that may or may not occur later on. What I'm hearing is that there seem to be fewer institutions that capture that addressing dimension. That's certainly not to say that there aren't any who do that. We've heard a lot about humanitarian assistance. I know that that is a key aspect of responding when a disaster occurs. It sounds like there is more to be done and more to be innovated on in that space. It sounds like there's quite a bit that happens in the immediate aftermath of a disaster in that humanitarian assistance context. But we need to continue to work to build back better, to continue to build resilient infrastructure thereafter, And there seems to be a lot of discussion that can and should occur in that context. To maybe just tick through a couple of the institutions I know we've been talking about here, and maybe some that we haven't. I've heard a lot of discussion about the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility that both exist under the convention as operating entities. I think they're very relevant institutions, and folks have mentioned their role here. I think we've heard that the GEF doesn't necessarily work in the averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage space. I'm not sure I would entirely agree with that characterization. It is the case that the GEF has to work on activities that are global in nature. That's true, that's a limiting factor, and it tends to therefore work more on mitigation activities and things that might feel more like averting. But they also do work on biodiversity, they do work on oceans, and I suspect there is some space there that it sounds like it'd be worth further discussion about how the GEF, in its role as working on global issues or issues of benefit to multiple countries, can work in this area. The Green Climate Fund we heard from yesterday, I found Juan's presentation really, really useful in this regard, and I was really glad that he brought in the aspects related to readiness as well as project preparation in addition to sort of project-based funding. I found really interesting in particular the point about the role that the readiness program can play in helping countries identify projects or activities that they would want to do in this space, how they could begin to improve their domestic environments for receiving humanitarian assistance. There's a lot of work that can be done in that context. I think it was also clear that the modalities of the GCF are not necessarily ideal for addressing this challenge. We've heard that really clearly from a number of folks around the room, and I actually jotted down quite a few of Mikhail's suggestions on this, which frankly I think we share the vast majority of them. I heard you mention the programmatic approach at the GCF. This is something we've been pushing for a really long time. I am personally very invested in that climate rationale paper that I would love to see better account for the different availabilities of information that countries have when they go to apply for GCF projects. I think that's a huge issue, and it is something that we're trying to take up with the board. I'd love to see that get done. We know as an outcome of COP26, the GCF was requested to look into the diversification of its financial instruments, including parametric insurance. You mentioned insurance a couple of times. I think that's another interesting direction to potentially take this. The challenge, I think, with the GCF, as folks have said, is it can be a little slow. The processes take some time. Enhancing access is really critical. We're part of the task force on climate finance access, and I think this is something that we really want to work with the GCF to figure out ways to enhance there. And they might not necessarily have the instruments to rapidly deploy as it seems like it's necessary. And in that context, I think beginning to look outside of the convention can be instructive. It can be helpful to see what kind of support, what kind of financial arrangements exist out there at the moment, including how they can be strengthened, how they can be improved, because I don't think anybody in this room would dare to say that the infrastructure is sufficient at the moment. I think we're all aware that the architecture has gaps. We're hearing very clearly that it has gaps and that those need to be identified and clearly responded to. So I think in that spirit, we would love to look more into the humanitarian space to know if the way that has historically worked in our pre-climate change world remains sufficient for the context we currently find ourselves in. Are there ways we can be addressing that humanitarian aid space to make it work better given the situation we find ourselves in? Recognizing that's not the whole piece of the story, there's a whole host of work that it sounds like can be done in the insurance space. We do a lot of work with African risk capacity, we do a lot of work with the CRIF, and it seems like insurance is another part of this conversation, but perhaps not all of it. I've heard a little bit of mention of the G7's Global Shield, which very much operates in that same context. That seems to be a relevant institution. The Santiago Network I've classified as sort of a not in the convention institution because in a way it is part of the convention. It's not an operating entity, the financial mechanism, but what it essentially does is it allows parties to connect to the right institutions that have this expertise, who themselves might sit outside of the convention. It gives people a place to go to identify, well, these are technical assistance needs that we have. Who has that capacity? Who can help? I've heard so much about capacity today and the ability to kind of get activities proposed, projects through the pipeline, and hopefully the Santiago Network can help pair folks with the right institutions inside or outside the convention to respond to those types of issues. The last thing I think I've just mentioned very quickly here is the role of the MDBs, which I'm sort of surprised I've not heard anything about thus far. The MDBs are some of the biggest development financiers in the world, and I think as we're all aware, development isn't effective unless it's climate resilient, and that includes after disaster has occurred. Once we are building back better, that is still a development activity where we need to make sure climate and resilience are mainstreamed into those activities. And as some of the largest capital holders out there, it's really essential that the MDBs are engaged in this conversation, that we make sure that they have the right tools, the right accessibilities to make sure that they are able to also participate in this discussion. One thing that they are really able to do that few others is to mobilize that kind of funding at scale. The GCF has a similar scale to many MDBs, but it's on a different level than the Adaptation Fund or some of these risk insurance facilities. So MDBs, if we're talking about major infrastructure investments, is one really important place to look. And again, the question I think becomes, how do we take a look at that institution and figure out which pieces are contributing to this puzzle? How are we currently arranging our funding for loss and damage? And how do we begin to work on that architecture? So just a couple of examples from our side, which I think are really helpful to identify. And maybe the last thing I'll say is that obviously this is a really challenging conversation, and it has been for the last several years. We really do want to engage in a constructive spirit and a constructive manner on this, and we're really happy to be here having this conversation, identifying these gaps. It seems to me like maybe one of the first things that we should do is undertake a serious mapping of what's out there and how well it works, and begin to do some lessons learned about how this exists now, so we can then begin to improve on it. That's something that it sounds like the WIM or the ExCom could happily take up, a mapping activity of that sort. It sounds like our folks from AOSIS have already done a fair bit of work on this that could feed into that process, and that seems like a very good place to start. So looking forward to continuing the discussion, and going to stop for now there. Thanks.
Thank you, United States. Next is Antigua Barbuda.
Thanks a lot, co-facilitator. And it was good to hear a lot of the different reactions from colleagues. Just some quick responses, you know, seeing that we're in a dialogue. The OECD, famed OECD, under it, it's the last time you see it doesn't even normally, I guess it doesn't concentrate a lot on its humanitarian assistance database that much, but the last available data that we have for humanitarian assistance for 2017, that's the last time they tracked. Maybe someone can probably give us some more recent data. It was $18.2 billion in 1 year. We have a current goal of 100 billion that we think is insignificant. I think, colleagues, you know, we do need to illustrate and understand that it is the proverbial and literal as well drop in the bucket. So we do need to figure out a discussion, and I know you kind of mentioned it a bit, Kevin, on the MDBs, development finance, but we have to understand that we're working in the parameters of climate finance, which is about the incremental cost. It is codified in the convention in Article 4 of the convention. That's continued through Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. The loss and damage finance that we're talking about here is incremental to that in which we use for development. And I'll give you a clear example. After Hurricane Irma, for us, and a lot of my GCF colleagues, finance colleagues would probably I would have made this intervention, this example. It's on a road that was completely devastated by the hurricane. We had to rebuild it. We went to our Caribbean Development Bank. They provided us with a loan. It's not necessarily concessional, but you know, and we got some assistance as well from the UK government's infrastructure facility, I think, under the Caribbean Development Bank. However, they only would fund to make the road resilient to a 1 in 20 year rain event. In order for us to make it to a 1 in 50 year rain event, They said that they couldn't fund us. It would be too costly for us as well, from the standpoint of how much we would need to pay back and the debt that we'd have. And so being an accredited entity to both the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund, direct access, we said, okay, we told our Ministry of Finance, let's go out to the GCF, let's stress test the GCF in its ability to address loss and damage, and pay for the incremental cost of climate change to make it from 1 in 20 to 1 in 50, which is aligned with climate resilient building back better. So our MDB, our development bank, could not give us the development finance in order for us to make it climate resilient. So what we're talking about here is the modalities in order for us to get that incremental cost to make it more resilient. We go to the GCF. We say that, in addition to expanding, raising the roads, expanding the drainage to make it more resilient, the area that we stopped on, because we had multiple amounts of different adaptation measures, the area that they stopped us on was burying the lines under the road, because they thought that it would be a high-risk activity that would take it out of the category that we're accredited for. This is the nitpicking and the issues because there was not that clear understanding between the Secretariat and us as an accredited entity, and the trust in relation to the fact that we're saying that we're not going to involuntarily relocate persons, which would then create it to push it up from a Category B to a Category A project. These are the modalities that are currently set up, because the GCF used the modalities of the World Bank, and they copied and pasted their environmental, social safeguard standards. And these are the challenges that we do have when we literally try to use the funding arrangements, and they do fail us. So what happened in the end? The end to the story is we built the road to 1 in 20 years. We built it to 1 in 20 years. We missed an opportunity to fund loss and damage. And it wasn't because of the lack of trying. We pour money into building capacity, which links to a point on this whole discussion about capacity. But capacity and process, they're two sides of the same coin. Because if the process is simple, then you don't need that great of a capacity where you have to write a thesis, literal PhD thesis. I've sat down and written at least a minimum of 2 GCF projects, and they're 200 pages long. 200 pages long. So, this is the I guess the issues that we do have when we're thinking about loss and damage and the actual simplification of the process. When a country in good faith is trying to build back better, and the door is literally shut. And mind you, again, it is not saying that we do not need the GCF. We for sure need the GCF, because it leads to a second point, right? It's on the discussion of eligibility. It's a ghost, it's a specter in this space. There's use of criteria that basically are not adopted under our process, that are then used to say, okay, let's give you climate finance, only if you do not have a GDP per capita of X amount. But let's ignore your climate vulnerabilities. Yeah, let's just put those aside, because we want to make sure that we can meet our ODA requirement of 0.7, I think now, 0.7. Of the country's GDP. And so let's try and keep that game up when we know that we committed to new and additional climate finance under Article 4 of the Convention that's continued through Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. So I hope that you're hopefully understanding, it's really not for lack of trying on the part of developing countries, and we pour a lot of time and effort into it. And all we are saying is that, especially when it's talking about this fit for purpose, and we try to reform the structures, and I can tell you anecdotally, I go to the guidance agenda item under matters related to finance. There are many finance colleagues around the room. We propose all of those amendments that we try to do with the existing arrangements to try and make it work, because we understand what you were saying about the transaction cost of creating something new. And then we're told, oh no, it is not the authority of the COP to make X, Y, or Z pronouncements on behalf of the board or request the board. When we know, in fact, and have showed evidence that we have requested, for example, to create RFPs for RED+. Why can't we create RFPs for insurance facilities? And what we reduced to in Glasgow, what happened was that we now get a paper from the Secretariat telling us that we can diversify instruments for insurance. The facility, really and truly, the facility is a manifestation of being ignored and being neglected. And we're now looking back, looking to draw back away from that neglection. But even if we continue to talk about this for 2-3 years, and we come back, it's 2024, and then there is this understanding under this process that is not a part of the process, and you say, okay, let us do these reforms X, Y, and Z under the guidance from the COP, which we consider as the supreme body can make those decisions and make that program guidance. It is in the convention. It is in the Paris Agreement. And then when we get into the guidance room, we said, oh, no. It's the board to decide. Come on, we can't be speaking out of two sides of our mouth here, colleagues. And I think this is what is happening. And I'm sorry to get a bit passionate about it, but it's just unfathomable. I really can't understand it. We talk about ensure resilience. I peel through that website on your ensure resilience to see how exactly, is there any evaluations being done on who the beneficiaries are? There's so many numbers, it's so pretty, it's a lovely website. But I cannot validate anything that ensure resilience has done. And so I really hope that other initiatives that are now building off of ensure resilience, like the Global Shield, which I have constantly been trying to get information on, because it sounds great, but we really do need to see how exactly that is going to play out. How is that going to help us out as it relates to addressing loss and damage, which relates to a specific point, again, on profiting from loss and damage. We're going to have to talk about that. Is the private sector, especially in developed countries, if it's not grant-based financing, are they going to profit off of loss and damage? And we're going to have to ask the question, is that correct? Because I'm hearing it. I heard an intervention yesterday talking about Article 2(1)(c) of the Paris Agreement, and I really was shocked, extremely shocked, because this discussion is in the context of Article 9 and Article 4 and Article 11 of the Convention, respectively. So colleagues, I really hope that we can be frank to see that we all acknowledge the gaps. We created the Green Climate Fund in 2010. At Cancun, we said establish the Green Climate Fund. We said these are the composition of the board. We then tasked a transitional committee. We gave them a terms of reference. We said, these are the operational modalities that you need to go and do. Take 2 years, you go and you deal with it, and you come back with us. This discussion on a mapping exercise, that UNFCCC technical paper of 2019 has done that mapping exercise. It's the same secretariat that has sat down and has said, basically, things are non-existent. So I really hope that we can have a more pragmatic discussion and stop shuffling around the cards. What we're doing, we're confusing basically motion with actual action, right? We're moving around things, but not actually acting. And I think the last thing I would say, because it was really to come back and actually address question B on effective support. I think that what what we really wanted to highlight is that we were inspired by the responses, for example, last year, by a lot of developed countries who are finally understanding loss and damage, right? So you had many different countries with huge amounts of flooding. So we have this question about what are we going to identify in relation to effective support. So my question is, I thought the responses in those developed countries were quite effective. So maybe it is that the developed countries can tell us and make us understand how is it that their support was effective? How is it were you able to unpack or create a fund or provide rebuilding and relocation of peoples when they were affected by the flooding? Billions of dollars were mobilized overnight. Treasury started to print money, right? What, is that the main difference? Is that the equitable divide that we have? Is that the fact that you have the means to do that in such a quick fashion and we don't? So it really is a question for us to sit down here and listen, because you all provided really good examples of how you responded to loss and damage. And we do really want to get an understanding of that. I'll stop there because of time. Sorry again, co-facilitator.
No need to apologize whatsoever. Thank you so much. Next on the list is Costa Rica.
Thank you. So we know many parties have already highlighted many of the remarks that I will make. However, we do wish to support and put emphasis on some of the points that have been mentioned based on the ILEC parties' different experiences in looking for support for loss and damage. So as many others, we also have looked in many occasions at UNFCCC funds and see numerous barriers for finding funding for all loss and damage activities, especially as has been mentioned, measures to address loss and damage immediately following an extreme weather event, as well as slow onset processes at an early stage of occurrence. It's slightly easier if projects have a strong element of addressing the residual risk of loss and damage ex ante, as others have mentioned, through resettlement or climate risk insurance. However, opportunities for ex post measures to address actual materialized loss and damage, such as rebuilding infrastructure and livelihoods. We've had experiences also in Costa Rica, for example, associated with bridges and infrastructure specifically, support for displaced persons, and measures to address non-economic losses and damages. Those are things that we, in different occasions, have tried to also include in proposals and have seen as extremely difficult to justify with current funding avenues. Marshall Islands and Antigua and Bermuda and others have already provided very important examples to emphasize that the very structure of the funds, the timelines, the multi-year project base are definitely not suited for responding to the nature of loss and damage. From the time a project begins to the point where we receive funding, it often takes too many years and effort to get there, while the cost associated with repair and reconstruction of assets, among other losses, continues to increase at the same time. In the case of Costa Rica, for example, the annual cost of repair and reconstruction of assets by extreme climate events already accounted to 1% of GDP in 2010. And we're estimating that the annual costs to extreme climate events only are estimated to reach more than 2.5% of GDP by 2025, which is very close. In terms of risk transfer instruments, again, we know that insurance schemes can help. However, we want to reinforce from our experiences that they cannot meet all of the government's ex-post financing needs. They can only be effective when used in combination with other instruments. And just to briefly also touch on what other people have mentioned in terms of disaster risk management finance, official development assistance, humanitarian aid, we are also of the opinion that even though there's some overlap between disaster risk management, for example, the costs of most disaster risk management measures is borne by national governments with little external support and with a significant proportion of the resources falling directly on households, even many studies have suggested, which should not be the case considering they already bear most of the non-economic and economic losses. Humanitarian aid, we also see, while there can be some sort of overlap, the levels of support provided are only a fraction of what is needed anyways. So to meet the scope and scale of needs, particularly in respect of resourcing, long-term funding requirements, we definitely needed. And then just the final point on the fact that climate change is an additional burden to developing countries. We consider support to address loss and damage also needs to be additional in quantitative terms to official development assistance. So because of all these different insights that we've been having as we discuss the topic, we definitely see the need to, as has been mentioned, to create a new loss and damage fund that exclusively addresses the needs of developing countries to address loss and damage associated with adverse impacts, along with strengthening existing funds to ensure financial resources for loss and damage are made available and additional from finance for mitigation and adaptation, and to ensure that these funds take into account both extreme events and slow onset events, and allow for funding to address both economic and non-economic losses as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Costa Rica. I'm just going to go through who I have. Please do raise your flag. We're coming at about an hour left, but I've got Timor-Leste, Can, the high level, David from the High Level Champions, Fiji, Guinea, and IFRC. So if you do want, and the European Union, sorry? And the European Union. So please, with just an hour left, if you do want to speak, I think you should put your flag up. And Panama. Fantastic. So, Timor-Leste.
Thank you very much, Facilitator. I could welcome you back, Christina, for being with us. We missed you after 4 or 5 years. So we are quite happy to have you here because you were part of the establishment of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. You know exactly what's happening. Let me also make some sort of adjustment for the arrangement issues under the question A. We would like to say that financial gap is still there, as I mentioned before. So what we want to get from this dialogue, we need to establish a new operating entity under the financial mechanism of the Convention and Paris Agreement. Article 11 of the Convention is quite clear. We can establish more financial mechanisms. Or Article, it's also guiding us to create operating entities. And Paris Agreement 9.8 is also very clear that financial mechanism of the current operating entities will be also served. So what we do, we can get some financial support from the GCF, like it was presented by GCF yesterday. That's for technical assistance, for Santiago Network. But really, to address loss and damage, we need to establish new one. I could say that point or question B is critically important. Support. We need more support because the current financial mechanism is not addressing actual losses and damages we are facing in developing countries, especially LDCs. We have learned some of our presentations since yesterday and even before. Risk insurance is there, risk transfer is there, but who is going to pay premium fee for the most vulnerable one? We as LDCs are having very limited capacity to pay that. So we need to have grant-based financial support for addressing loss and damage. Since Decision 3 CP18 is strongly say that the role of the Convention is very important. So we really need to have that. So what we could do forward based on the current lessons learned. As a solution, loss and damage finance should address or should adhere to the principle of first, international solidarity, historical responsibility, and polluter pays principles that I just mentioned before. Secondly, new and additional financial resources need to be allocated to the loss and damage issues, especially addressing loss and damage issues. Needs-based, adequate, predictable, and precautionary issues will be critically important. Locally driven with subsidiarity is also critically important for developing gender perspectives, and equitable representation is also critically important. And public and grant-based, once again, grant-based is key, and balanced and comprehensive approach financial mechanism. This is also critically important, especially for gender and an inability people to address loss and damage issues. And in terms of next question, I think if time allows, I can go back later on, but so it will allowing parties to go ahead, or I can finish my intervention first. Okay, thank you very much, Christina, for giving me more time. So in terms of question C, barriers and challenges, of course, some challenges I've mentioned before. So current financial availability under the convention and also the Paris agreements it's only for adaptation and also mitigation. It means what? Averting and minimizing, no addressing issues. So we do see that it means for addressing loss and damage is still gap, so we really need to have that sort of mechanism in place. No financial support, I could say, example, for addressing rehabilitation issues, displacement issues, recovery after disasters. Let's say in my country, last year, my country was hit by a tropical cyclone. We lost infrastructure at the value of $25 million US. 42 people were killed, and displacement were too many. 25,000 of community in capital Delhi were evacuated to safe place. So this is something that we need to address, because my government does not enough capacity to address those risks, those disasters, those displacement people. So we are discussing about this. So this is the gap. So what will be the solution for this? We need to take solution. That's why we need a dialogue. This dialogue needs to be party-driven, and this is, of course, party-driven, but it should be leading into the negotiation, to get negotiation process to take decision. We don't want to have a second dialogue of Suva dialogue. We really don't want this. In terms of solution, the loss and damage finance facility that we discussed about should provide financial resources, simplify the access to developing countries, allowing both international access and also national, especially grassroots, quickly respond issues will be critically important under this facility. I just discussed the issue. I was late because I discussed some issues with some ambassadors around regarding this issue. They are asking about grassroots action, but I asked, how can we have grassroots action if there is no financial mechanism, entity in place to address or to facilitate financial resources out there? We are also considering that the EU has already provided 25 million into that loss and damage issue for 4 countries. And I do hear that the Canadian Prime Minister is also going to provide support for loss and damage. And in fact, when we had a conference of parties in Glasgow, local government in Glasgow, they've already contributed. So we look forward to get more contribution for this. But who is going to manage That's why we are going to establish financial facility with a credible entity in place to manage that financial issues. And in terms of other issues related to question D, I think this is also a very good question. And in terms of what can be done, I've already mentioned some. We need to establish a new credible financial facility in place under the convention, under the Paris Agreement, to deliver the financial resources for addressing losses and damage faced by the most vulnerable countries, LDCs and small island states, and Africa and others, developing countries who are vulnerable to the impact of climate change, especially losses and damage. So I think I do not need to go through more deep discussions, but this is something that we look forward to get out of this. But we really need to be clear what will be recommendation from this into the negotiation process, party-driven process to get COP and SEME decision for establishing facility, financial facility for addressing loss and damage. This is critically important. Once again, we really don't want to have a political declaration. We need decision. We need to establish the facility in place to help the most vulnerable one. Thank you very much, Christina.
Thank you, Timor-Leste. Can.
Thank you, Madam Facilitator. I am Sandeep Salimarai. I am speaking on behalf of the CAN, the Climate Action Network. So, as a CAN, when we look, especially the question number one, and what we see is that we need to really unpack the question number one, especially that what we had already heard from the parties over here. There is a kind of funding on the issue of avert and minimize, because avert is mostly from the mitigation perspective, and for minimizing is all the insurance mechanisms and others are already existing. But having said that, because most of the minimizing can be done through adaptation finance, but when we look, the recent IPCC Working Group 2 report has clearly indicated that 4 to 8% of the public climate finance is only going on adaptation. So there is a huge gap that we are really aware of. And coming to the point of addressing loss and damage finance, for CAN or for civil society like us, we have not heard any funding mechanism to address loss and damage that is under the convention. So there might be some bilaterals that is ongoing, which we are not really aware of, but this is the issue of climate change, and we are talking in the convention process. So far, we as a CAN, we are not really aware of any financial mechanism to address loss and damage. So we really want to see how that particular issue can move forward. However, we also do acknowledge that there are a lot of humanitarian funding that is ongoing, but we as a CAN, we really see the humanitarian funding is not really linked with the loss and damage funding, because most of the humanitarian funding is based on, I would say, on the solidarity issues. But for the loss and damage is more at the obligation point of view. Is an obligatory part is really need. And we as a CAN, we also really support what we had heard from a intervention from the AOCs and the LDCs regarding to establish a loss and damage finance facility. We really support for that, and we are also really keen how the loss and damage finance facility can really bring the issue of loss and damage into one, I would say, umbrella rather than in a scattered manner, so that we are not really working on the silos, but we are really trying to bring coherence among all different issues of addressing loss and damage. And lastly, what the Costa Rica, as well as we heard from the Master Island, and the non-economic losses is also one of the critical components that we need to look. The non-economic losses has been really overlooked in this discussion, and I work for WWF, and the loss of ecosystem, loss of biodiversity, I would say, the ecosystem services that we get from all this critical ecosystem and biodiversity is really critical. And what, if the losses and damages happen to those issues, how are we going to address that has not been really captured well into this discussion. Though there is a NEL expert group, but still we need to have much more constructive discussion onto that aspect as well. So let me stop there by saying that so far there are some funding available to avoid and minimize on the issue of loss and damage, but there is no any funding of how to address the loss and damage so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Next on my list is David from the High Level Champions.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak, Kevin. Yeah, I work for the High Level Champions team, so it's really good to hear the views of parties, particularly some of the really strong voices from the LDCs and SIDS. That was really, really powerful, I thought. I really want to offer some reflections from the non-state actor perspective, and the climate champions are focusing on, on action by non-state actors. So yesterday, responding to the call in the Glasgow Compact, which urged non-state actors to take action on loss and damages, the High Level Champions opened up a dialogue with non-state actors on the actions they're taking now to address losses and how to drive increased action now. And if you forgive me, Priscilla, just underline the importance of this. Nigel Topping, one of the champions from the UK, he stressed the urge for action now. And again, it really hit me hard from listening to parties and others that KwaZulu-Natal, 448 people died, 12,000 homes were destroyed, 40,000 people displaced. That's happening now. It's also happening now in South Asia. Heat waves are destroying people's livelihoods, destroying crops. It's happening now. So the end I think from Nigel was to say we need action now, we need investment now. Dr. Mahidin, the Egyptian champion, highlighted that we'd run a series of workshops with non-state actors on all the actions they are taking now. And that includes communities themselves, as well as many other businesses, cities, and obviously regions. So we also heard a very strong statement from the First Minister of Scotland, non-party stakeholder, on the actions they're taking on loss and damage. So we really saw a lot of things that were happening. And so this is sort of invitation, really. The champions are going to work over the next 6 months with non-state actors on what they're doing, but also how we can take those rapidly to scale now, and that means finance as well. It means finance now, whether it's private finance or public finance. So we look towards sharing those at COP 2027. There'll be a resilience hub, so please come and join that, and also happy to share at future Glasgow Dialogues. But underline these only are going to have to complement the actions from states. But we really want to get action happening now. So if you have any non-state actors who want to work with the champions on ourselves on this, please point them to us. So I was going to say keep it short. So thank you, co-facilitator.
Thank you. Fiji?
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator. Ultimately, following on from the sentiments provided by Antigua and Barbuda on behalf of AOSIS and the Marshall Islands, we also see the real risk that despite the assumptions offered by our co-facilitator, that we also hope are true, and from the baseline of understanding that there are some fundamental misunderstandings in relation to scale, urgency, and context. For example, we strongly feel that there is an ongoing issue whereby parties are conflating the existing and traditional humanitarian risk financing landscapes with loss and damage. Fiji is not aware of any early warning system for forests, mangroves, farms, and infrastructure. Early warning systems may be able to move people and avert loss of life, but they cannot do the same for ecosystems. Similarly, how would we go about accessing funds from the Adaptation Fund when there are no feasible adaptation activities for interventions to fund? Global solidarity may help provide food and humanitarian support following a disaster event, but it will not replace the longer-term losses that arise. If we truly take in the science, look at the performance and, most importantly, the effectiveness of the existing climate financing architecture. It is literally a frightening thought to think about relying on these structures moving forward. We cannot rely on a volatile global solidarity, donor whims, and a mishmash of contingency funds and grants to restore the livelihoods or cover the costs of absorbing unprecedented shocks. We need to focus on the science and foresight provided by the IPCC report. Loss and damage experienced today will not only be the same scale of loss and damage experienced tomorrow. Where is the finance that prepares us for the tipping points and the dynamics of climate risks we cannot anticipate and adapt to? If we do not create real contingencies and financing arrangements that target specifically the situations in which irreversible losses occur, the cost to the global economy will be catastrophic. What we are asking for is finance that is correctly purposed, accessible, and there to buffer the impacts that will bleed between borders and sectors. Fiji sees wider and broader questions in relation to the final question D. Rather than creating greater synergies between existing funding activities, we think the question is more about how do we create better synergies between the principles and objectives of the Paris Agreement. Recognizing and providing targeted financing for loss and damage is imperative because without this, we undermine the experiences that are already happening. We neglect the communities and the people that are already affected. We undermine the underlying premise of the Paris Agreement, which is the collective effort to address this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiji. IFRC, sorry? Guinea, please.
Thank you, co-facilitator. I think demonstrating that the system that is currently supposed to be averting, minimizing, addressing loss and damage is not fit for purpose is actually is based on the assumption that we have to convince partners that loss and damage is an urgency. So the assumption pretty much depends on the underlying matrix that you use for that. So for me, again, we are 25 years or going to 30 years under the convention. I think this is an overdue discussion. It should have happened before Paris, and yet we are discussing in a dialogue, open-ended, and trying to make the case for loss and damage. So I think that is very important for my end to indicate. So I will not go into the detail, and I very much like the passionate, because it is about communities, it is about people, the passionate example, concrete example, and challenges presented by Antigua Barbados. The question, what support has been effective at averting, minimizing, addressing loss and damage, and what are the lessons learned? I will change the question by asking myself whether the system in place, whether the support available are effective, because even there are support provided. We have heard colleagues mentioning a range of mechanisms. Of course, we acknowledge those mechanisms. Let me give you some examples. Let's talk about the disaster risk reduction. It is falling short of the resources, and research, evidence-based research has proven across the globe. I give you, not in Africa, for instance, in Nepal, or in Fiji, for instance, there was a case there where the UN emergency response fund has provided 500,000, while the estimate was 65 million. That's a good example, not in Africa. And yet we say that humanitarian response is part of a game. It's not part of a game because it has failed. If it has worked, we would have recognized that and explore all the complementary activities, complementary solutions that we'll provide. I give you also an example from humanitarian. Based on evidence, research have proven in case of extreme event or loss and damage associated with climate change, one-third of the support is provided by the family, the very family of the affected people. And then, in the case for Africa, for instance, then the diaspora, because the diaspora is not a very family, is not very relative because they are living outside, and their flow, the money they are sending is playing much more result and percentage in our GDP than the development assistance that we are getting from our from our partners. So to me, the question is not about whether there are support that are effective. It is about first recognizing that there is a gap and recognizing that addressing loss and damage is an unknown land that no one has really visited. The IPCC is clear. And I think, as I indicated, we need a whole system approach. The whole system approach is also outside the convention, because I think my colleagues from Antigua Barbados pretty much covered the funds under the convention. But outside the convention, the MDBs that are having more resources channeled than the funds under the convention and declare as climate specific without, again, the assumptions is subjective from our perspective. The underlying assumption for the qualification of their activities that they report is not climate specific. The MDBs are also having the same access difficulty. And I think I'm not quite sure what is the solution at this point of time, but access, to my point of view, is about the availability of resources. And that is at the core of this discussion. We can talk about the funding, we can talk about the mechanism, we can talk about improve access. It is all about the resources, predictable, new, additional to adaptation funding, at least as far as Africa is concerned. New, additional to adaptation funding. And once we have clarity about where and how much is going to flow, the instrument is very easily set up. And the accessibility, there is a correlation, in my point of view, between the accessibility, the modalities, and the resources available. The less resources, the accessibility will entertain a narrative that says there is resources, but there's no capacity. From my point of view, there are support available, but compared to the needs, drop in the ocean, they are part of addressing loss and damage that are not covered. And I think the outside world, the humanitarian, the disaster risk are not subject of this convention. They are voluntary. They are voluntary. You cannot have a consistency. If you look at the pledges going to the humanitarian, you cannot have a profile of a country. It depends on geopolitics. It depends on a lot of things. We are talking under the convention. We need to talk about a system that can assure countries, if they are doing through the Santiago network, take a risk assessment, that those risks, at least a certain percentage, is covered. And it's not about mapping. I mean, the UNSCC have done a lot of work about mapping of organization. If we are talking about mapping, it is to recognize the effort by our countries in addressing loss and damage. Because at national level, there are a lot of innovative mechanisms set up with the scarce resources of a budget, taken from the health, taken from the school building to address loss and damage. And they have innovated the institution in light of budget constraint. So I think it is all about assumption. My assumption is, I think we need also to consider that the correlation between the resources, where the resources are coming from, how much is available, will pretty much define the accessibility and the level of effectiveness at averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guinea. It's very apropos that the next person on the list is IFRC. There has been a lot of conversation in the last 2 hours about humanitarian assistance. I am going to throw something provocative, trying to capture some points of view, which is, from some, I'm hearing that the humanitarian system has failed and therefore isn't part of the game, which to me, I could read as, so you're off the hook. You don't need to be thinking about the issues that have come up in this space. And maybe I'm summarizing incorrectly, so please raise your hand if you feel like I'm not hearing you properly. But Kirsten, what's your take?
Wow. So first of all, there have been some amazing interventions that are really quite daunting and quite touching, and the comments about the urgency and the breadth of need, I can only agree with and say that that's what we as a disaster response, disaster risk management agency see every single day where we work. And recognizing that in the media we talk about the big disasters, but we also see the small ones every single day and the people that are affected. I would like to say that I think that saving lives and livelihoods is an essential part of the piece on addressing loss and damage, and would ask that we not forget that part, but I also recognize it is a small piece, and the scope and the breadth of the need, as outlined by Marshall Islands, is massive. I also want to agree with what Guinea said around who provides the support to affected communities. And you are absolutely right. The first responders are the people themselves, their families, their neighbours, the direct community. And it's local organisations that are doing a vast majority of the work, and then governments, and the international humanitarian system is a very small slice of that piece as well. And then the question was around, so I wanted to cover three things. First of all, the scope. Secondly, this issue about the drop in the bucket. And then thirdly, what are some of the positives from humanitarian funding that maybe we can learn? So the first piece around scope. Yep, we only deal with the immediate life-saving, and a specific piece around anticipatory action, disaster risk reduction, specific mostly to fast onset events. We do not cover reconstruction. That we hand over to development actors. In addition, we tend to work in a specific raft of countries, and we have a particular challenge getting funding for certain activities in those countries where things fall between silos. So to give you an example, if we want to do disaster risk reduction work in a conflict-affected country, you talk to the humanitarian donors and they say, this is development work. You talk to the development actors and they go, this is a conflict country, we don't fund it either. And so you get nothing. So our scope is limited and we are struggling in certain areas. Secondly, this piece around a drop in the bucket, as mentioned by Antigua, or a drop in the ocean, as you said. And again, you're right. To give you a couple of statistics, in 2020, humanitarian aid was a total of $30.9 billion. And that, the vast majority, was for conflict. The total volume of ODA with the primary purpose of DRR in 2019 was 1.9 billion. So yes, a drop in the ocean. I would add to that that if we look at the emergency appeal of the IFRC, and our requirements last year were roughly $1 billion, and if you look at the emergency appeals led by OCHA for the combined UN humanitarian system, they're roughly 50% funded only. So even the piece that we are dealing with is not fully funded. So all of those caveats to begin with, I wanted to respond to the question asked by a colleague from the United States about, are there some useful things to learn from humanitarian financing? So there are a couple of things that I think maybe are attributes that have been called for in whatever financing mechanisms exist and could be improved or could be established, which we have some lessons on. The first is about speed. And I think this is clearly an attribute that's being asked for. So we have our disaster response emergency fund, where we have a fund that is sitting and waiting for the moment a disaster works. Now, having sat as the head of delegation in a country affected by disasters, I had 10 days in which I had to submit my application. It was roughly 10 pages long to respond to this question, about 200 pages. It was 10 pages long. I had to do it in 10 days. To be frank, I did it in 1 day. And I got the funding that I needed, and I knew that I would get that funding that I need, and I had the answer that the funding was coming within 24 hours of submitting the application. There is similarly, at a larger scale, UN OCHA manages another fund, the CERF, C-E-R-F, and they disperse roughly 850 million in 2020. And it's a similar system, possibly a little bit more complicated, possibly a little bit less fast. And of that, about 100 million went to fight rising food insecurity, a fair bit of which is related to the climate crisis. So I think there's a piece there around speed. There is a piece there around anticipatory action and anticipatory funding. So we have been working in the humanitarian system to make our funding a lot more anticipatory, meaning you have a forecast that an extreme event is about to come and you get assistance to the community before it hits. So that is often in the form of cash. It requires a whole heap of advanced work and planning, anticipatory action protocols, triggers, you name it. But it means that you can give somebody cash, they can use that cash to evacuate, to save their livestock, to take away their seeds, potentially to try and put sandbags up around the houses, whatever it might be that can save lives and livelihoods. The next piece that I think is an important factor is we prioritise the most vulnerable countries, communities and individuals. And indeed, some donors have specific windows or some funds have specific windows to target forgotten crises and forgotten communities. So again, this is something that we see as a challenge in the climate world. And maybe just to say one challenge with some of the adaptation funds, if you do an analysis of where the climate adaptation funding is going, very little is going to fragile and conflict-affected countries. And that is a real gap. That also means that the losses and damages in those countries can be a lot bigger than they should be. Well, they're all a lot bigger than they should be. The other piece that is probably useful is that the funding is accessible to a wide range of actors. And so climate adaptation funding at the moment is not really accessible if you are not a government and a government that has been approved and has gone through a process and has the capacity to access a large amount of money. So what is useful about the humanitarian funds is they can come in small blocks to a non-state actor. It could be a national society, it could be an NGO, it could be a local community organisation, it could be a UN agency. And so the wide range of actors mean you can provide assistance in a wide range of places. And when there is limited capacity in one organisation or one government, then there might be capacity of somebody else. And so it does mean that you can get a greater diversity. I think those are probably the main points that are worth considering. And again, huge humility that this is a tiny scope and tiny scale, and that we are not in any way capable of filling the gaps that are out there, but maybe there's a couple of useful lessons there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, IFRC. The next is Panama.
Thank you very much. I would like to echo on some remarks that reminds us that loss and damage are not being addressed properly. I know this is reiterative, but I do believe we need to mention it again and to understand where we as a world in loss and damage funding. A study has estimated that annual loss and damage finance needs range from $290 US to 580 billion by 2030, 551 to 1,016 billion by 2040, and 1,132 to 1,741 billion by 2050, with developing countries shouldering most of the burden. These loss and damage costs are separate from the cost of adaptation, and according to recent research, neither post-disaster nor humanitarian aid or adaptation finance are adequately addressing the needs of communities that are already experiencing loss and damage. Economic losses directly suffered from climate change reduce countries' ability to invest in climate change mitigation and adaptation measures, affecting directly the country capability to respond to climate change impacts, making it even more vulnerable to climate change. To mention just a quick and direct example, in Panama between 1982 and 2008 was affected by 32 natural disasters, with economic losses over $86 million, with the most of these economic losses being addressed within the country and through loan. This alone represents an extra burden for our country, without even mentioning non-economic losses. We are facing loss and damages due to slow and onset events and extreme weather events, like Hurricane Eta and Iota, for example, or community displacement. And this is putting a lot of pressure on our economic system, which we can't afford to keep allowing as a developing country. Definitely, current arrangements are not sufficient, nor they respond to the reality countries are facing with climate risks increasing day by day. Because climate change is an additional burden to developing countries, support to address loss and damage also needs to be additional. In quantitative terms to official development assistance, time is something developing countries cannot afford. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Panama. I have the EU. Norway, Antigua, Barbuda, and Guinea.
Thank you very much. I have quite a bit to say as a finance person from that conversation, but I would first like to thank very much everyone in the room for the previous interventions. It's been extremely useful and interesting to listen to all of that. I think the sense from the room is that we all agree on the need for support for activities relevant to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And I think we all agree on the large scale of loss and damage associated with climate change. And maybe we don't have the figures right now, and maybe it's not possible to put figures on this, as said our colleagues from the Marshall Islands. How do we qualify the loss of culture? But I think we agree that this is significant or even maybe overwhelming. I think what we've heard also from the presentation yesterday and from the conversation today is that there are significant efforts in the financial mechanism, in the development world, in humanitarian assistance, to respond to these needs. There are efforts, but these efforts do not match up with the needs and the types of action needed. In other words, I think countries need to seek finance from a wide variety of sources, because loss and damage has been looked through several channels and several types of activities, and not as one concept. Now, I have to say that the EU is in favor of a holistic approaches to all of this package, which means averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage through systemic approaches, recognizing that climate change will have impacts at all levels of society and across all sectors of the economy. And therefore, cooperation and coordination, inclusive engagement of all actors is really key, so that we can look at this. And I think this is also in line with internationally agreed standards and principles that we view as foundational to international cooperation. I will not quote them all, but for example, the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, principles of harmonization and mutual accountability, and the Grand Bargain Commitments agreed at the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit. This is to say that there has been quite a lot of thinking and track record on how do we ensure this cooperation. So we will continue to refer to this whole spectrum of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage as a broader approach to avoid fragmentation of efforts. But we are, of course, ready to look at different elements along the spectrum, including ex ante and ex post and thematic areas, such as those underlined by Article 8, for more detailed discussions on specific areas. And on that, I have to say that personally, the examples that I've heard today across the rooms were really useful and instructive, and I think this is the value added of this dialogue. The question now is what can be improved, both on the channels of funding and on the volume of funding, and I'm going across the various questions here to speak about that. On the channels, I think what we've seen is that there's these various actors, there's this diverse architecture. And what we as parties have previously decided to do about this is to try and improve this architecture through the Santiago network with better coordination of these multiple actors. And this is what we decided to do in Madrid and to strengthen again in Glasgow. And maybe there are some more steps to be taken on this. But I think this is an avenue to consider. But we also need to look at all of the other actors that were named, and for example, the channels of the development world, so that they are fit for purpose. And I hear this previous statement from the colleague from AGN on the Mozambique example. And to expand on this, one of the actors that provide economic support through crisis, and not just climate change crisis, but all of that kind of crisis, is obviously the IMF. Now, the IMF is designed to intervene with concessional loans that are much beyond market rate, but these are not 100% grants. And if we want to look at a specific instrument that is not this one, then of course this is a different type of intervention that we need to mobilize. But do we really want to consider that all of these interventions from the development world will not be relevant? I hear there are concerns about eligibility criteria in development assistance on the World Bank, on international financial organizations in general, and I think there is work to be done here. It's an issue for many countries. Not all of this work can be done in this room, but I would personally agree that we will need to adjust those criteria to climate change. The point here is, what existing arrangements can we lean on so that we do not duplicate action, but enhance and expand action? And I think this is particularly relevant in the context of the intervention of the colleague from the Red Cross. I don't have the full acronym, but the person in red. On the GCF, since this has been mentioned before, I agree that the GCF has its shortcomings and is not entirely focused on addressing loss and damage. It has other purposes, and it was created in a wider context. We have seen yesterday that the fund is funding activities relevant to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. Could it be doing more? Maybe, but when the GCF was created, parties gave to the board the authority to decide what the fund will be supporting. So this is where this conversation should happen, and of course the institutional arrangements can change over time, but at the moment there's not much more we can do. I would also note that the GCF is only one of the finance providers. I mean, in average, it has around 3 billion of commitment authority per year, so I don't think it's an answer of the scale we are discussing here. On the scale of funding, I've spoken a little about this at the beginning, but the IPCC states that the magnitude and rate of climate change and associated risk are overwhelming. And these adverse impacts and related losses and damages escalate with every increment of global warming. We are discussing here impacts that translate into an amount that will probably be higher than the total GDP of all current climate finance donors. So this is why I feel this is beyond climate finance. It's another type of conversation. And I will not, in this forum, highlight the EU's contribution to climate finance, the EU's contribution to development assistance in general, because I think this is also why this conversation is relevant to Article 2 and C and to the alignment of all financial flows, because it's beyond just these numbers. Now, we probably need to have conversations around adequacy of these channels, around coordination of these channels, around gaps on all of these channels, and I think this is what we've been doing here so far, and we can dig deeper into this. But again, I think the use of specific examples and maybe more support from actors as well, like we just did, would be definitely useful. Thank you.
Thank you, European Union. I have Norway next.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who has contributed here today, because it is, I think it has been a very useful session, and there are some clear messages coming out here that we heard, and especially on the addressing loss and damage, because we know it's not enough money for averting or minimizing, but your message on the addressing loss and damage is crystal clear. And how can that be substantially strengthened? What can be done? And I hope that these examples and what have been said here will be clearly reflected in what is coming out of this day too. I think it's mainly answering to the question C, what are the barriers and challenges? But I think they are very important messages and a basis for the further deliberations that should be done on how can this be met. And this, what is clear is that the challenge of crisis is big, and we think that in addressing this, we have to look at the whole architecture, as a little bit like EU also said, and also that you mentioned from Guinea that on the rest of the MDBs, for instance, but that we shouldn't limit ourselves just to look at what is being done under the convention, but what is the whole arrangement, what are the tools that are there, and it is definitely a question for scaling up finance, but it is also a question of having the right mechanisms for this finance, and I think we need to use a lot of mechanisms that are out there to get this right, and there are initiatives and there are pilot programs being scaled up. There are various things that can be scaled up to meet this, and that doesn't have to wait for new mechanisms to be established. So I think in going further, we have to look at the whole picture, and but first and foremost is that we have to build on what we've heard here today are so clear examples on why it is not functioning today. And at the end, thank you to IFRC also for what you were presenting. And I think it is very important that we look, humanitarian action is not the answer to this, but we have to be much better in looking at how are we combining the humanitarian action and the long-term development, so we are getting out of these silos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norway. Back to Antigua and Barbuda, please.
Appreciate me allowing me to come back a third time, co-facilitator, but I think we had some really good discussions. I think the reason why I came back was, I guess, a bit to unpack the really good question that you did provide on the humanitarian assistance. And I think we should look and focus on the reason for being of humanitarian assistance and the essence of it. It's goodwill, right? It's our inner human essence of trying to help one another out of the goodwill, out of a heart. And and it is the focus, as I said, it's a drop in the bucket. It's the initial start. And I think where we think that from beyond that, and then you look at development finance, that is looking strategically at how a country develops, right? But climate finance, it's but for there being that climate issue, this is the reason for you having that climate change finance. It's the incremental costs as I keep on harping on, right? And so they do work together, right? But the thing is, what we're saying is that there's currently none in that, or basically virtually none in that addressing part. And the climate finance is very important to the sustained response beyond what humanitarian assistance can do. But mind you, as I said before in other interventions and examples, it's quite crucial that it comes in time, you know, and it fits in, and it coordinates, as colleagues have been saying. So I just wanted to make sure that we understand that the reason for being for climate finance is linked to the convention, linked to the principles of the convention and the Paris Agreement, and that is one of the key defining distinctions between all three of those types of finance. In addition to that, and that's why in Article 4, when it was drafted and looking at the negotiation history of the convention, you saw that there was a specific mention to new and additional. And this is not only for climate. It's for other environmental matters, other multilateral environmental agreements. And we can now try to play and say and redefine what new and additional means. It means new and additional to what you contributed last year. But we all know the negotiation history of those treaties clearly state that is the reason for it, is that we had development finance, there's these environmental issues, this is looking at the Rio Declaration and basically all the Rio Conventions, and that time in which we were trying to build up international environmental law. And we are saying that we would have to choose between developing or addressing the environmental degradation. And then we chose to sign up to these treaties knowing that we don't need to necessarily make that choice, and then the incremental cost. This is in the Jeff's governing instruments. It goes on and on this. So I think we need to be quite transparent on that. And so it reaches to the next point of those other two types of finance, humanitarian and development. They have their metrics, they have their criteria. I don't think we can trivially just kind of say that eligibility, you know, we'll discuss that. It is fundamental to the treaties and to what we are talking about here and what we're trying to solve. Because we're not trying to solve under climate change development issues. We're not trying to solve humanitarian issues. We're trying to solve climate change. So therefore, what is the key criteria that we have a clear understanding as it relates to being able to be access climate finance? And it is your climate vulnerability. So it doesn't matter if you are, because it doesn't matter if you are a SID with a huge GDP per capita, especially knowing that that is a skewed metric based on the fact of population and other things in relation to financial flows getting into your country that don't have anything to do with the poorest and most vulnerable in your country. So let's not even start there. But it goes beyond that. And it goes directly to the discussion on just the pure vulnerability you have with climate change, because it doesn't matter how many early warning systems you have. I'm coming from an island of 108 square miles. 108 square miles. We are well aware a hurricane is coming at us. What are we going to do? Pick up? And a hurricane is 4 times, 10 times the size of us. So what are we going to do? Pick up and go to another country so in order to save the lives of our people, or move our assets outside of the island? Is that what that, because we understand early warning systems. I come from a country where I've known climate change, hurricanes all my life. But what I'm noticing now is they're more frequent and they're more potent, they're more intense. And we cannot bounce back. We don't have the fiscal space, the capacity to deal with that. And so I think it's really good for us to understand that, you know, we try to look at these different things. We know what happened with Article 8 in the Paris Agreement, And that article, what is it, Article 8.5, that looks at that list. And we know what happens with that averting, minimizing, and that being added into the text. Because if you look at the convention text as it relates to the WIM and how it's approached primarily on addressing approaches. So it's a clear understanding that what we're discussing here and the different types of finance, it's really crucial for us to understand that we can't, for example, push aside eligibility issues because we're going to have eligibility issues with humanitarian assistance and development assistance. And I can tell you for a fact, after Irma, we had huge pledging conferences at the United Nations. Many countries pledged to assist us with humanitarian assistance. Then they looked at the DAC list and they said, no, we cannot give you, or they don't respond to our emails anymore. That is the reality. It is literally just linked to our climate vulnerability, and we have to be able to address that. And so that is why we really and truly need, and one of the colleagues said, an umbrella organization, an entity that allows to have a synergy under our system with our rules, understanding things that we can multilaterally adopt. Not the World Bank where you have to be the biggest shareholder to make your votes, or not the IMF in which you have to be the biggest shareholder to make your votes and the decisions. We know the governance issues in those organizations. We do not have a say on those entities. So we cannot tell the IMF that, oh yeah, you need to give SIDS eligibility in relation to this climate crisis. So I think again, we need to be really, really frank about it. I think one last thing I'd mention is being scared of scale, being scared of these figures. And the question I have is that, so we're scared about the magnitude of loss and damage. We're already financing it nationally. And the reason why we're not going to give more funding for loss and damage is because we're scared of the scale of loss and damage. Even saying it, it just completely, it perplexes me. It's a conundrum. So what are we then to do? You know, what do we have? And we talk about the 21C. Let's talk about 21C in the aspects of the trillions of fossil fuel subsidies that a lot of G20 countries around the table still spend right now. Trillions of dollars that could be in loss and damage. That's scale, right? That is scale. That is the exact opposite of net climate finance. We're spending money in this direction for Article 9 and trying to solve the problem, but there's so much more going into the other direction. That's the 21C discussion I'd like to have, because that's where we can get our adequacy from. So, colleagues, I don't know, like where the, and I would just sort of finalize the discussion as well that we're having again with the GCF. And I want us to again be quite frank. We understand that colleagues are saying that we do not have a discussion potentially for institutional changes right here under the COP, under the CMA guidance. We get to the board, we cannot even begin to try and institute the reforms that we wanted to do. We in good faith say, okay, let us dwindle down to the most reductionist text that you would ever see. It is actually embarrassing. And sometimes I can't even say that, said to my minister, that this is what we've come back home with from a position of having a request for a proposal to capitalize our underfunded insurance facilities, which is clearly outlined in the convention and in the Paris Agreement. And what we have to show for that is a paper that they're going to look at for the diversification of instruments. We're all complicit in relation to this. And I go to the board, and I act as an advisor to the SIDS board member. And we try to socialize these ideas in the board. And then there's the same discussion about, oh, this politics, I don't think that this will happen. RFPs are not effective, whatever the case may be. But let us try. And you wonder why we push for a specific facility? Because we can't get it done in the places that we're promised that, oh yeah, you can get it done. So I just think, co-facilitator, that we do need to focus on the solutions, because what I'm trying to say is that AOSIS has tried. And we've tried multiple times. And I would like the colleagues the powers that be, to let us know where's the best place to try, noting that I think we've tried everywhere. So thanks a lot, co-facilitator.
Thank you so much, Antigua Barbuda. We have about 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes left. I have Guinea and Bangladesh left on the queue. Guinea?
Thank you, co-facilitator, and I think you have shown a lot of skills in helping us further, There's an echo, okay. Yes, so the facilitation was great because it actually helped us to present concrete cases, and I think that is very important. And the dialogue looks very promising, and we very much hope that the follow-up will be the follow-up sessions will actually advance what has been said. So I think I will summarize by saying that one of the big issues is there is no definition of loss and damage, and particularly loss and damage finance. And the definition of the convention is too broad. The framing, averting, minimizing, is very difficult sometimes to differentiate for addressing. And we have all heard that we are more interested and concerned about addressing, because that's where people are left with their destiny, and you can definitely get forgotten. And I think also we have seen there is no dedicated funding stream to support in the full picture the loss and damage. Loss and damage, we also are of a view, and I think I have picked that the resources available and channeled through streams are sadly inadequate with respect to both quality and quantity. And I think also climate-compatible sustainable development is critical to avoiding reducing loss and damage, but remains, as far as most of the countries are concerned, developing countries, critical, and it should not go down in this critical time of COVID, of a war in Ukraine, and frequency of climate events. It should increase. However, climate finance obligations are distinct from the development obligation, from the development support. And I also agree that we have undertaken, the Paris Declaration, the Ghana Partnership, and so on. Those are features that we can definitely bring to make the system being effective. However, as far as we are concerned, and I've indicated that loss and damage finance is new, additional to adaptation, and the assumption is that adaptation resources is additional to ODA 0.75. So loss and damage is additional and new to adaptation funding. And we have also seen that aspect of disaster risk remain and are playing critical role in addressing loss and damage, but there needs to be upscaled and to avoid minimize and avert loss and damage, but they are not fit for purpose for the whole spectrum in terms of comprehensiveness of activities areas related to loss and damage. We also have seen that humanitarian assistance has their due relevance, and I can quote, for instance, because today I had a discussion, I tried randomly to contact some African countries that have been at the front line of loss and damages. And Sudan told me, I said, what is the best practices there? They said they mobilize their own money, but they go through Red Crescent and NGOs because they know those institutions have a connection, have the skills to come to the most vulnerable communities. So there is institutional arrangement happening there, the scale, the quality, and the quantity of resources. That is the big question. And I think also the system here, the standing committee, for instance, have been requested to work on loss and damage finance, but has not been responded because I think it is why I think we definitely need to have a whole systemic approach out of the box, not to target an institution, but to see the complementarity, what can be enhanced, and also be pragmatic to see the limit of a system. And that is what I was talking about, the whole systemic approach, and I think that is definitely, and I think the example of my colleagues from SEEDS, from LDCs, the ambassador indicated it is a systemic problem. So I will stop here and thank you for the very dedicated facilitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You are a very easy group to facilitate, so I'm not actually doing much work. Bangladesh, you have the last word.
Thank you, co-facilitator. So I'll make it very brief. So as it has already been reiterated again and again in today's session alone, is that averting and minimizing is already being done through early warning systems and disaster risk management and so on and so forth. So I'll just focus on the addressing part of the equation. That is basically, that can be very simply put into an inflow and outflow of fund. So in terms of inflow, we already have a number of state parties like Scotland, Wallonia, and as Ambassador Adao mentioned, the Canadian government, all showing leadership in putting a step forward towards this agenda. And then we have the non-state actors who have been tirelessly working to mobilize action and support for the loss and damage agenda. So now in terms of finance for loss and damage, what we need is for countries to agree and work towards actually paying an annual sum in show of solidarity, something that the developed countries have already agreed for mitigation and adaptation. So as the third pillar of climate change, why not do the same for loss and damage? And then once we have the money ready, we then need a facility to collect and hold that pot of money. And for that, we need an operating body to manage it. And once we have that pot of money and the operating body, then we need a mechanism to deploy that fund. And our suggestion from Bangladesh, I would like to make a suggestion that we can complement this action by setting up a proper national mechanism of individual countries, which can be mobilized by the Santiago Network or by the Action and Support Expert Group of the WIM, in terms of the technical guidance, who can pinpoint the needs of their own countries and their climate vulnerability, and then the national mechanism can act as an intermediary between the international facility and the on-the-ground local communities. So this process is actually fairly very simple, and it needs to be exactly that. Simple, direct, and accessible, so that we can finally focus on the addressing portion of the Article 8 of the Paris Agreement. That's all from me. Thank you.
Of course, Japan, you have the last word.
Sorry, I know very last, all of you are very tired after 3 hours of discussion, but yeah, it was a really good opportunity to hear a lot of experiences and then the thoughts about this topic. And then I have to be honest, I'm pretty new in this area. I've just been appointed as a climate change negotiator in this field, and then I have to say that this is very new. But it is very good, great opportunity to know what's going on, and then these issues. Of course, I have read documents, but listened to those comments today, like this in this occasion, is really helpful. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Maybe I'm not responding to those important notions from all those countries, but please let me just briefly reiterate Japan's position. So Japan believes that we need to deepen its understanding of the synergies and complementarities between efforts to avert, minimize, address loss and damage, and those related to adaptation, disaster prevention, humanitarian assistance, disaster risk financing, development, etc., taking into account the results and lessons learned from past experiences. And then on top of that, the impact of support should be increased by implementing various initiatives in an integrated and coordinated manner, rather than by implementing each initiative individually. So as the colleagues from Norway and EU said, holistic approach is a key word on Japan, for Japan as well. And related to this, Japan has a couple of experiences to share with. Firstly, as the host country of the third UN Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015, Japan has committed to promote the Sendai framework of disaster reduction. And that includes efforts in disaster risk financing. In addition to supporting capacity building and infrastructure development that contributes to disaster risk reduction for developing countries. So one example of this is the disaster risk financing that is provided to developing countries in response to disasters. Another example is the provision of a mechanism for countries vulnerable to disasters to agree on a loan support framework and the use of funds prior to the occurrence of a disaster, and to promptly provide funds upon request from the borrowing country when a disaster occurs. I know many of your colleagues are pointing out the problems of that, but still, it is worth talking about the lessons learned throughout those initiatives. And just a last example is in addition, JBIC, Japan Bank of International Cooperation, has been actively involved in the disaster risk financing in neighboring countries, such as by playing a leading role in the establishment of disaster risk insurance in the Asia-Pacific region. Also, in the case developing countries are affected by natural disasters, the JBIC also provides various types of humanitarian assistance in response to the damage caused by the disasters. So we have contributed in this way. I know that I understand the comments that this is just a drop of ocean in the ocean, but still we would like to maximize the effectiveness of this. And then by doing so, support for those vulnerable communities can be secured. That's our standpoint. So Japan would like to use these experiences to contribute to the constructive discussion on how to address loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Japan. We're about 5 minutes over time, and I wanted to thank everyone for staying and engaging in this, what I think was a really rich discussion. Just one reflection from me, which does not in any way capture the richness of this conversation. To be honest, I disagree with me if I'm wrong. I don't think we've changed positions. I still see divergence in the way parties are approaching the arrangements for funding for loss and damage. That said, in 3 hours, the idea of actually coming to convergence is unrealistic. I do hope, though, that this has been an opportunity to better understand the positions and what underlies those positions, and hopefully with that better understanding, we can, what was it that you said, that motion does not necessarily equate action, that we're moving in a direction that is responding in a sufficient, adequate, and effective way. I have the job of trying to capture an oral report of these 3 hours. on Saturday during our last day, and I will do my best to try to do that. Of course, I will probably not do a great job, so please do come in on day 3 to complement what I'm saying when I get the report out. But thank you very much for this excellent discussion, and I'll see you on Saturday.